with great pleasure, Mr. Rick Doblin, Dr. Rick Doblin.
Thank you very much. No matter how much work I do towards psychedelics, I will never be able to repay the tremendous benefits that I've gotten from my own experiences and from the tremendous participation with the community. So that's what keeps me going for all these years. And now I also want to acknowledge that Ben is actually wearing a suit coat. And so I think there's this tension about being a rebel, or kind of are we counterculture, or can we become mainstreamed? And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the latest developments with our research, but also not just breaking convention, but becoming conventional. And I think that's really the goal, and that's really the arc that I'm trying to describe with what we're doing. It's becoming conventional, and I think that's something that the world and the culture needs a great deal. Now, I'd like to just briefly start out why. Now, MAPS is a nonprofit organization focused on developing psychedelics and marijuana into prescription medicine. So we're a nonprofit psychedelic and medical marijuana pharmaceutical company. And we're using the route of science and medicine to change culture. But the deeper reason is this idea of the global spirituality. And I think that we have to, from my perspective, find the doors that are open and work through them, but recognizing that medicalizing psychedelics is only part of the story. And it's only part of the benefits. And in fact, while it makes a fundamental life-saving difference to people with PTSD, people who are scared of dying, it transforms the life of people who are autistic, adults with social anxiety, all sorts of people struggling with addiction, that those are great benefits, but that the more profound benefits from a society, from a human species point of view, will be when these drugs are reintroduced into the mainstream in terms of healthy people for personal growth and for spirituality. And this concept was affirmed for me by Robert Mueller in 1983. And he wrote this book, New Genesis, Shaping the Global Spirituality. He was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And his basic theory was that we have the United Nations to mediate conflicts between countries, but that a lot of the conflicts underneath it have a religious basis. And that if we can help people from different religions realize that they're just different windows under the same spirituality, that will produce a certain kind of tolerance, compassion, and that could, again, reduce warfare, reduce conflicts, and build more cooperation. And so I wrote him a letter and I said, I totally agree with your theory, but you didn't mention psychedelics. And psychedelics have been used in the Good Friday experiment and others. They've been used for thousands of years. So it seems a big omission from your book. Every new way of killing gets unlimited money in terms of the military. So would you try to help reintroduce psychedelics into science and into our medicine? And he wrote me back. And I was a college undergraduate. I felt like I was on a deserted island, putting a note in a bottle, throwing it, into the ocean. And then he wrote me back saying, yes, and I will help you. So I think that this concept of how psychedelics can have, through the mystical experience of unity, political implications, that's really the reason for me, beyond just medicine, which is enough. Medicine is just enough. It's more than enough to help people who are suffering in different ways. But it does have a deeper perspective and a deeper purpose, the work that MAPS is doing. And it does have, as Terry was pointing out, and others were pointing out, it does have this connection to human rights. And so this was just one of our funders, the Pritzker family, Lieber. Last year they donated $600,000 to MAPS. And their foundation is focused on human rights. And so this was the first articulation of a funding agency ever of the role of psychedelic research in a human rights agenda. And so I'd like to acknowledge their courage in doing that. Now, how does medicine really relate to this larger issue? So this is briefly a chart over the last 40 plus years of the attitudes of American voters towards the legalization of marijuana. The top line is against marijuana legalization. The bottom line is for. And you can see just a few years ago, it crossed 50% of American voters are in favor of legalization. But the crucial point that I'm trying to make now is that this is the 70s. This is the Controlled Substances Act came in 1970. Very few people were in favor of legalization of marijuana. It grew, it doubled, more than doubled to 1976. And then what started happening, that was the election of President Carter. Those of us who were around then were like, oh, marijuana is going to be legal any day now. It's all inevitable. It's right around going to happen. And then massive backlash. And it was the rise of the parents' movement. And then 1980, we get Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan elected president, and then the Just Say No and the massive expansion of the drug war. Drugs are a national security threat. And then things stabilized for almost 20 years. You can see here. Now, right around here, there started to be this gradual increase in support for marijuana legalization. And the question is, why did that happen? Now, right here in 1996 was the first two states, California and Arizona, that legalized medical marijuana. And this is the rise of the medical marijuana movement. And exit polling, the people that are working on marijuana legalization are now well-funded, sophisticated, and we've used exit polling. And so it turns out that the most important factor in terms of whether somebody is for the legalization of marijuana, it's not if they use marijuana themselves. You might think if they're a user, they don't want to be criminals. But even more is if they know a medical marijuana patient. So there's so much misinformation that if people have direct information from somebody that they know that marijuana has helped medically, it causes them to question everything they've heard about it. And then that causes them to be more likely to be in favor of legalization. So I think the medicalization of psychedelics will change attitudes. Also, what's going on, of course, is religious freedom and the widespread use of ayahuasca around the world and the cases that have been won in the US Supreme Court and elsewhere throughout Europe and Brazil, so that we have the medicalization of psychedelics, the religious freedom, and I think something similar is going to happen, but it's going to happen for marijuana first. So I would imagine that we're probably 2024 before the legalization of marijuana in the United States on a federal level, and probably another 2040 or so for the legalization of psychedelics. Now, change is happening faster than we think. A lot of us are seeing a lot of change. Maybe these predictions are wrong, but I think that's what's going to happen. So all that said, now when we start talking about the medical use, really it's about the medical use. It has to be evaluated on the basis of the science. It has to be working with the best scientific methodology. And I've just created a context, but when we enter the drug development world, it's about the science, and that's how the regulator is going to react. And we're going to try to do what we can on the political context to help them focus on the science. And there's a lot of debates about how that works, but that's the basic goal. So what I'm going to try to show you is how from 1984 is when the DEA first tried to criminalize MDMA. And they put an announcement in the Federal Register, and a group of various scientists and therapists and others, we gathered together, and this is a picture of me walking to the, right before I walked in the headquarters of the DEA to file the petition saying, let's have a hearing about preserving the medical use of MDMA. So I kind of felt like, here I am spying on the DEA, kind of equalizing the score there. They didn't know what was about to hit them. They had no idea that MDMA was a therapeutic drug. All they knew was ecstasy. They didn't know the code name Atom. They knew nothing about this underground therapeutic use. So how do we go from there to, this is the DEA's portrayal of MDMA, ecstasy and predatory drugs. This is 2000 Oprah. This is just the worst example of the use of neuroscience, the misuse of neuroscience and doctored imagery to try to scare people about MDMA causing holes in the brain. And these are fake, by the way. I mean, they're graphically manipulated. So any area that was in the SPECT scan that had blood flow below a certain area was just portrayed as a hole. So that's how we get to that. And then, just a few years ago, Oprah, in an effort to atone for a little bit of the misinformation that she'd spread all over the world, she had her O magazine, a reporter, do a story on MDMA. And she even permitted this reporter to take MDMA in an underground therapy setting and then report on that at the end of the article and how much that helped her. And there was only like one sentence that this part was illegal, but it was all just like, oh, okay, now I took MDMA and here's what happened. So it's fantastic, and this, of course, is propaganda in the other direction. You know, this was one dose miracle cure, that's all you need, but, you know, I'll take it. And then we want to get to this, sales of prescription GMP MDMA. So how are we going to do that? This is too complicated of a slide to really go through, but I just want to show you that we have hired a woman from Novartis who used to manage their phase 2 and phase 3 studies to manage our drug development. And so we have this expands out, massive chart, but our current projections are 2021 for MDMA becoming a prescription medicine. And it's very inspiring to having just followed the talk on S-ketamine, because we've been looking at S-ketamine because it's the first mental health drug, as you said, to be given breakthrough therapy designation. And both Hefter with their psilocybin work and MAPS with our MDMA work will be applying for breakthrough therapy designation. And if we get it, it expedites drug development, and it can be done with fewer subjects, less money. But one of the things and the vision that I'm trying to portray to you now is that what MAPS is doing is really trying to create a nonprofit pharmaceutical company that moves from constantly asking people for money. So this is my opportunity to ask you all for money and just be reminding you all that the research that we're doing is, so far, for MDMA at least, not funded by the governments, not funded by large foundations, although with Ben Sessa and the British study, we've just submitted a grant to the Wellcome Foundation. Several years ago, they said no, it's a reputational risk for them to be involved in MDMA, and because of a lot of the social change and the developments, now they said they would welcome the Wellcome is welcoming a grant application. So, but we're funded by individuals. So if any of you are motivated or inspired to support MAPS or Hefter, that's how the research is being done. But we have a rare opportunity among nonprofits, which is we're talking about having a product at the end, which is MDMA or psilocybin. And once we have these products, for a long time I thought, okay, they're automatically generic, there's no way to get any income on them, it's just fine. It's, you know, we've helped bring something out into society. But what I didn't realize until a few years ago is that the FDA and the European Medicines Agency has a program called data exclusivity. And what that means is for drugs that are in the public domain, if you're the first one to make it into a medicine, the first sponsor to make it into a medicine, nobody can use your data to say that it's a generic drug in the US for 5 years, in Europe for 10 years. Now, somebody else could do their own research with MDMA for PTSD and then they could sell it. Or somebody could do the research with MDMA for any other thing and sell it for that, and then there'd be off-label prescription. So our goal primarily is to do social change, make psychedelics available as medicine. So we are helping anybody who wants to compete and try to make MDMA into a medicine. All of our protocols are online, our review of the literature, everything we're sharing with people, but there is this possibility that we will be the first one, or Hefter will be the first one to make MDMA or psilocybin into a medicine. And then we have a choice. Do we sell it at cost, or do we sell it for slightly above what it costs? And what we've found is that for MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, or anything else, for what Alicia was telling you about earlier, that really it's about the therapeutic interaction. It's labor intensive. It's not so much about the drug. So if you're paying $4,000 or $5,000 for the therapy, if the drug costs $25 or $100, it doesn't really affect very much the treatment, but it affects the profit that comes back to the sponsor, the manufacturer. So there's the possibility that MAPS would become able to fund further research out of the proceeds from the drugs that we get approved. Now, once that happens, we're not talking about a nonprofit venture. Now it's a business, and you have to pay taxes on that. And one of the main critiques that's happening now about the legalization of marijuana is that you hear people say, we don't want big tobacco, we don't want big alcohol, we don't want American-style capitalism trying to massively market these drugs to the heavy users to make the most money. And there's a lot of wisdom in that concern when you look at what's happened with alcohol and tobacco. So there's a new twist on capitalism that's been developed in America, and it's called the benefit corporation. So right now, if you have a corporation that's a for-profit regular corporation and you have shareholders, the shareholders can sue the management if the management is not maximizing profits. And a lot of times external costs to the environment in any number of different ways aren't paid for by the people that are actually selling the products. And so you could have a socially harmful situation where all these corporations are maximizing profits. So the benefit corporation was created for people that want to set up a corporation where you're not required to maximize profits, you're maximizing social benefits. And there's several thousand of these now, benefit corporations in the United States. So MAPS has created a benefit corporation that is going to be used to market MDMA once MDMA becomes a prescription medicine. And we're purposely not taking investments in the benefit corporation. We're still relying on donations to MAPS as the nonprofit, and then MAPS will subsidize the benefit corporation to do the research. And then this benefit corporation will eventually be the one that markets the MDMA. So that's the core idea that we're developing. And I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's designed to reassure regulators as well that if they were to permit MDMA to be a medicine, that it's not going to be necessarily like some of the concerns they have with big pharma marketing other drugs. So I think it's a way in which to try to create this self-generating engine of resources for psychedelic and medical marijuana research. Now, just as an example, 15 years ago, this is the best example ever, and I'll tell you why it doesn't apply to MAPS, but 15 years ago, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation invested $150 million in a drug development effort for cystic fibrosis. The drug Kalydeco was really recently approved, and the nonprofit retained a percentage of the net sales of the drug, and they just sold their rights for $3.3 billion. All of which is going to be going now for cystic fibrosis research. Additionally, now, the cystic fibrosis story is different. It doesn't really apply to MAPS, and it's because, first off, cystic fibrosis is an orphan disease. PTSD, end-of-life anxiety, even high-functioning autistics with social anxiety, there's more than 200,000 of them per year. That's the cutoff for an orphan disease. And orphan disease now is, in a way, kind of a scandal in that pharmaceutical companies, once they have an orphan drug, they charge enormous amounts of money. So this Kalydeco, obscene, $311,000 per year. And sales are increasing. It's going to move up to $1 billion. But there's been a lot of criticism of the nonprofit because they had no incentive to try to reduce this price to pressure the pharmaceutical company, because the higher this price, the higher they could sell their rights to it. So MAPS is not in that situation. PTSD is not an orphan disease. MDMA is off patent. And we're talking about $150 or $1,000 a dose. Just to say this, on Monday I'm going up to Newcastle, and there's a company there. We've been negotiating for about 6 different companies for the last year on who's going to make medical grade MDMA for us. And so we're about to buy 1 kilogram of GMP MDMA for about $350,000. So it's extremely expensive. It will get less over time, and I just want to acknowledge again Dave Nichols and the great work that he did in 1985, where he made MDMA for us for research, $4,000 for a kilogram. Now, he actually got a better yield than a kilogram. He got like a kilogram and a half. We still have 960 grams of it left in a safe, and it's not going to be, the GMP MDMA that the people in Newcastle are going to make is not going to be any purer or better than what his MDMA is. And his MDMA, made in 1985, is what we still use in our research 30 years later. And it's still super pure. It went from like 99.98 to 99.87, something like that. Incredible. So, but it's going to cost us, as I said, $350,000. So this is what we're talking about. I think we're going to end up like $150, $250. And if so, we just project net income of somewhere like $35 million over 6 years. So also what we were trying to sell to donors, a story that it's high leverage. If you can help us make MDMA into a medicine, there's a chance that you can use the rest of your philanthropic dollars for something else. Now, of course, these are all estimates based on the number of therapists that we're going to train the number of patients that they can see, what the price are. So these are all just hypothetical, but this is, and several people said to me, don't even make this public because somebody else will compete with you to try to do this. And so I said, I want somebody to compete. I would rather, take drugs on the beach and let somebody else, do this. But they haven't surfaced yet. So this is sort of just the idea that the MAPS here, gets the donations, we invest in the BenefitCorp, and then the royalties come back to MAPS. Now, here's what's going on with MAPS right now. The first thing to say is that the most important thing that's going on is not going on by MAPS. It's going on by governments all over the world who are funding research into MDMA. And so if you go to Medline and you put MDMA or ecstasy, there's over 5,000 papers right now. At a cost, we estimate over $300 million. So now we have 2 studies underway in the US, winding down. They'll be done. We're going to collect the last data in our phase 2. Our last primary outcome data is going to be December 3rd. 2 studies in the US. One is veterans, firefighters, and police officers, 24 subjects. The other is in Boulder, 23 subjects with PTSD from any cause. We have a study in Israel that's going to have about 8 subjects, and a study in Canada with 6, and we've completed a study in Spain with 5, and another study in the US with 21. So we're going to end up with around 90 subjects, data from them to go to FDA and the European Medicines Agency and say, we think this is a breakthrough, serious or life-threatening illness for people who are treatment resistant, and therefore it should be approved as a breakthrough therapy. And we also have the study that Alicia just talked about with MDMA for social anxiety in autistic adults, and we've just started a new study with people who are life-threatening illnesses. A little bit different than the Hefter group in that we're not just focusing on cancer, we're broadening to any kind of life-threatening illness with anxiety. And we have a protocol, we have FDA permission that we can give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And we can take people from all over the world to our program to give them MDMA. So that was the key part that demonstrated to me the FDA's sincerity, because we said we need to train therapists and you can't do it in any legal way with an illegal drug unless it's in a protocol. So would you give us a protocol? And we worked it out with them and with DEA, and we were doing that. Now, here's what we've learned in our phase 2 study. The first, and in some ways really important point, is that the safety concerns are minimal. Nobody overheats and dies, nobody has hyponatremia, drinks too much water, nobody commits suicide, nobody has panic attacks that last very long. So we've got excellent, these are people that are traumatized, and again, as we saw with the ketamine, people who are going through difficult stuff. Several of the people said, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. So we've learned that we have very large effect sizes. And several of the studies are well over 1 in terms of the effect size. So this is a breakthrough for those people that are treatment resistant. We also have learned that it doesn't matter what the cause of the PTSD is. We did one study, mostly women survivors of childhood sexual abuse or adult rape, another study with war-related veterans, and we've had people with industrial accidents. Biologically, what seems to be the case, and psychologically, is once people get stuck with PTSD, that it really is the same kind of disease regardless of what the cause was. So that means we can enroll PTSD from any cause in our phase 3 studies. That's really, really good. And also what we found is we spent a lot of time trying to figure out methodologically, how do we do this double-blind design? What is the way in which you do a successful double-blind study? And so our thought was low dose, dose response. And low doses, you confuse people because it's all everybody is getting MDMA, the therapists, the patients might not be able to tell which dose, and that if we can show a dose-response relationship, that would be the way we do these studies. And that's what I did my dissertation on. That was my suggestion. And the beautiful thing about research is you find out new stuff. And so what we found out is the low dose, 30 milligrams, 25 milligrams, 40 milligrams, has an anti-therapeutic effect. People get activated, but they don't get safety enough. There's a higher dropout rate, and so it's not a fair comparison. And in our consultations with our FDA consultants, they've said, compare MDMA to inactive placebo. And when you do that, so it's still double-blind methodology, but the emphasis is on, first off, randomization. So everybody has to be equally motivated, and if you have everybody equally fulfilling the same inclusion-exclusion criteria. They're equally motivated. They get randomized to the different groups. That's crucial. And then the system of independent raters and how we do that. So we're going to have a team of calibrated evaluators of PTSD symptoms, and they will do it all by telemedicine. And there will be a random assignment. So they won't necessarily know, is this the person's baseline? Is this the person's outcome? Is this the mid-evaluation? Is this their one-year follow-up? So it breaks that link. And so that's how we're going to design these studies. But what we still have to figure out, it's probably going to be a 3-session model. What we've found is that people go deeper on the second session than on the first session, although the first session gives them so much hope that on average their PTSD symptoms go down more after the first session. But there's something about some people need more sessions, particularly people that are more traumatized, that have some dissociation. So we like the model of 3 sessions, and it's only going to be a question of cost, really, but we're leaning towards 3 sessions. We offer half the initial dose after the 2 hours have passed, or between 1.5 and 2.5 hours. And many times people take it and it really helps. Other times people say they don't want it. So we're going to continue with the supplemental dose. The big thing that is still unclear to us is in this dose response study with 30 milligrams, 75 milligrams, and 125, the 75 milligram group is doing better than the 125. For those of us that have experience of MDMA in multiple different contexts, including those of us who are doing it in group settings or party settings, a lot of times the 125 is preferred. I personally prefer the 125, but what we're trying to understand about memory reconsolidation is it may be that at lower doses, people are grounded more in their biography, and so when they recall a memory of something traumatic, it doesn't, they're not distracted by a lot of these waves of good feelings, the dopamine waves of good feelings. And so it could be that this is why lower doses may work. And what we've found fundamentally different than what Matt was presenting to you, and what the Hefter has learned about the correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes. What we found is that there is no correlation between the mystical experience and the reduction of PTSD. And that further supports this theory about the memory reconsolidation. So what we're thinking of doing is the first dose will be 75 milligrams, and then the second and third sessions, there'll be the ability to have a discussion between the therapist and the patient about do they want a little bit more, a lot, a minimal more, or 50 milligrams more. I mean, again, we'll be doing this in a double-blind way, so it'll be a little bit tricky, but that's likely how we're going to design phase 3. Now, one of the things that I just want to raise that I think is really important, and Torsten Passy was here before, is that we're doing work with the military. One of the reasons is the military has more guns than the police. And I think that's one of the basic things that we need to acknowledge, is that in our society, how do we bring something in? How do we bring something in with a system of prohibition? So you look for allies. And actually, the police can be our allies. And in our study of 24 veterans, police officers, and firefighters, we had 20 veterans, 3 firefighters, and 1 police officer. So if we can end the war on drugs, I think all of our relationships, or many of our relationships with the police would fundamentally change. They would become our allies instead of we'd be cautious about them. And police have an incredibly hard job, very traumatic job. So Senator Rockefeller, though, who was on the Senate Veteran Affairs Committee, has helped us with the VA. So now we're collaborating more with the VA, and we're doing we've got a lot of support from the military. This was Richard Rockefeller, who tragically died in a plane crash last year, who worked this, and Michael Minhofer, and this was our meeting in the Pentagon, which for me was incredible because I was a draft resistor for Vietnam. And for Michael, it was kind of incredible because Richard encouraged him to cut off his ponytail, which he had for 30 years, to go to this meeting. And Michael did it, and he said he likes it now. All right, so what we're moving towards is something that I'm very excited. Now, when you work with trying to make drugs into medicines, you can only work with diseases. We're only curing illness. But one of the best uses of MDMA is couples therapy. But difficult relationship, or even a good relationship, it's not a disease. There's no way to make MDMA into a medicine for couples therapy. But it turns out that the VA recommended that the first collaborative project we do with them is a therapy that they've developed where it's couples therapy where one of the couple has PTSD. And this is now going to be the first experiment where 2 people are going to get MDMA at the same time, both members of the couple. So far, it's always been individual therapy. Now, eventually, we can talk about this later, but I'm sort of curious about what you guys are thinking about end of life or even smoking, about where you might work with groups. But for the FDA, for IRBs, we're all working with individuals. But this couples therapy approach is going to start in October, and it's a major breakthrough because, again, 2 people are going to get MDMA at the same time. It's still looking at PTSD, but there's all sorts of measures of how couples communicate in a relationship. So we're going to be learning about couples therapy. And here with Ben and Matt Hoskins and John Bisson, we're going to be doing a study at Cardiff University where it's a veterans with PTSD. It's not a therapy study, it's an fMRI study. But in a way, it is a minimal therapy study. The question is, a lot of people take MDMA, they go to parties, they go to raves, they go to events, and they end up feeling better, and they say, hey, this helped me this way or that way. So why do people need therapists? A lot of people do need therapists, but some percentage of people will be able to get better to some extent on their own. So this is a study that is designed with patients. They're going to have a certain support. We're not calling it psychotherapy, but in addition to seeing how their brains work under MDMA, in the scanner, we're also going to see, are they getting better, are they getting worse? So that's really exciting. And then we're talking about proof of concept studies to train new teams in Germany and in Australia to try to get ready for phase 3, because we want to do phase 3 internationally. And this is our timeline. We're going to, as I said, we're going to complete these studies in the fall. We're going to apply for breakthrough therapy. Then end of phase 2 meeting is designing the phase 3 studies. And then we're going to start them, and then this is what we hope to approve. Now, we're also doing work with marijuana. So I know I just have 1 minute, but if I could just have 2-3 minutes more. I just want to say that the reason that we're so interested in marijuana research is because with marijuana research, the politics is blocking the science. And I feel that if we have an open door with the regulation of psychedelic research all over the world, but if we can unblock the medical research with marijuana, that will protect what we're doing with psychedelics. So I felt politically it's been very important for me to focus on medical marijuana research. And marijuana is used for PTSD. But for PTSD, marijuana is more of a palliative treatment. It's used every day. It doesn't solve the problems. It reduces symptoms. But it's a valid treatment. And when I had a meeting with the FDA to talk about the marijuana study, at the end of it, I said, I just want you all to know that our priority is MDMA. It's about a few sessions. People then can be durable remission. They don't need any other drugs in many cases. And marijuana is actually the ideal drug from a pharmaceutical company's perspective because you need it all the time. You need it every day. If you stop taking it, your problems come back. But what Dr. Tom Loughran, who is the head of psychiatry products, he says you don't need to apologize for treating symptoms because in psychiatry, that's about all we do. So we have now been able to start this marijuana study. It took 6 years, massive opposition. But we just got a $2.1 million grant from the state of Colorado. So they got all this money from taxes, from legalizing marijuana and medical marijuana. They just gave out $8 million for marijuana research. And so we've got $2.1 million. We're also going to be doing a study with ayahuasca for PTSD. It's an observational study. And some veterans have gone down to Brazil and Peru, and so we're working to just look at how that works. We want to become, in a sense, the experts on PTSD. And we heard also that ketabine's been used for PTSD, showed some efficacy. So we're going to, and also we're doing studies, we're writing up the results right now of ibogaine for opiate addiction. Again, an observational study and showing it was effective. This was, Sanjay Gupta was really helpful. This is just the money flow for the 2.1 million. The next big step, though, is breaking the government monopoly on the supply of marijuana. This is the kind of marijuana they've supplied in the past. This is the kind of marijuana we want to supply. We've had, from 2001 to 2013, we had a major battle with the DEA, which in the end we lost, but we won enormous credibility, and it helped fuel the medical marijuana movement because they saw the DEA was blocking everything. So we were able to win the administrative law judge lawsuit, but we lost because the DEA rejected the application, and then we lost in the appeals court. But we're going to try again. And we also do psychedelic harm reduction. So as we move towards this post-prohibition world, it's really important to reduce the anxieties of regulators. What happens when young people get the message, these drugs have value, and then they go use them in different places. And so what we're trying to say is that if we can work at festivals and places where people are using these things and provide support, so a lot of times the crisis that people may have with psychedelics is really a healing crisis. It's really good. So we are now implementing this. We've had over 10,000 volunteer hours on this. We've done it all over the world. And this was our setup at Burning Man. This was our 20th anniversary in 2006. We decided to celebrate it at Burning Man. It seemed totally appropriate. But the important point here is that the Burning Man organization has been very scared about formally getting involved with psychedelic harm reduction, because there's a law in the United States, the RAVE Act, reducing America's vulnerability to ecstasy. We don't want too much ecstasy in America. So this was when Vice President Biden was the senator, he passed this. And it's criminalized efforts to do harm reduction. So the Burning Man organization has been reluctant. But this year, the Bureau of Land Management, the federal police on whose land Burning Man takes place, went to the organizers of Burning Man and said, we want you to do more psychedelic harm reduction. So this is the first year they've put our Zendo project in the survival guide. So we're starting to create high visible examples of psychedelic harm reduction in festivals that will hopefully spread. And actually the role model here, of course, is Cosmicare at Boom Festival in Portugal. They're the world's leader in doing integrated psychedelic harm reduction. These are our principles: safe space, we're sitting, not guiding, you talk people through, and difficult is not the same as bad. And this is essentially trust, let go, open. It's very similar to the approach for psychedelic psychotherapy. So, becoming conventional. This is the last two slides. So we're going to train therapists. We're going to establish psychedelic clinics. We're going to try to incorporate psychedelics into standard practice. We're going to expand the medical contexts. And we're going to fund future research. By expanding medical context, what I mean is that these psychedelic clinics that we're going to be setting up will eventually, I believe, permit us to work with family members, to work with people who are not the designated patients, and eventually I think there'll be sites of initiation where you can go, you can have a psychedelic experience, it goes well, you know what's involved, and then you get a license and you can buy it and use it on your own in any place. So I think that's the long-term path to integrating psychedelics within society, starting with medicine, and then we end with peace. And this is relates back to Robert Mueller. So thank you very much. And